A peaceful drive through a quaint southern town was the plan. The road was almost deserted, the sun was high, and until she saw the red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror, the woman driving had no cause for concern. There was only a slow, crawling cruiser following her, no siren or call over the speaker, each and every turn. Elegant, composed, and totally within her rights, Celia Monroe was drawn to the side. She wasn't driving too fast. She had a valid license. She owned the automobile. And, however, in less than 60 seconds, 2 yelling policemen had broken in her driver's side window, and her wrists were fastened to the door with a zip. They never inquired about her identity. They didn't check the dish. Nothing was explained by them. And cop yelled at her to leave, holding her hands out in the open. When she didn't cooperate quickly enough, the other pounded the glass with increasing wrath. Her voice remained composed when she questioned why the stop had occurred. They looked more enraged by that. Next came a textbook instance of excessive force, and in a matter of minutes, scores of onlookers had their phones out, recording what would quickly turn into a viral maelstrom of citizen and bodycam footage. The police continued to yell even after pulling her out into the pavement. They said that she was acting suspiciously, but the only thing that seemed off about her was that she was cool, collected, and not what they had anticipated. What they were unaware of, the fact that this wasn't just any black woman in a fancy automobile, was something they never would have imagined. The constable was this person, head of the U.S. Department of Justice's prosecution. One of the most powerful women was the one they just attacked. Senior federal representatives are charged of looking into civil rights abuses, such as those perpetrated by legal enforcement. Furthermore, it was already too late when they eventually ran the plates. The vehicle was enrolled with the DOJ. Minutes later, a black Suburban pulled up next to the scene, wearing coats embossed with the department logo. 3 agents emerged. The officers' expressions changed from one of pride to one of terror, as they realized they hadn't just infringed the rights of others. They were the focus of a federal civil rights probe that they had started. Millions of people had seen the film by the time it was over. DOJ every major outlet saw a trend about a prosecutor who was wrongly incarcerated. It was covered by the national media. Hashtags went viral. Discussions erupted. However, underlying the news headlines, the outrage, the reposts, and the popular phrases like there was a more subdued tale of racial profiling, police wrongdoing, and body cam evidence. A woman's story about not flinch, didn't freak out, and didn't have to yell to get the system to change. Her lack of responsible authority. And that authority would later hold a whole department responsible. Celia Monroe never wanted attention. She liked quiet better than show, accuracy, and performance. Instead of the viral media, she spent her days in courtrooms and behind closed federal doors, headlines that now shouted her name on all of America's social media feeds. However, there was no broken glass at the start of this story, her story. It started years ago, in a city where justice was more than a profession, in a different sort of courtroom. It was a matter of survival. The birthplace of Celia is Jackson, Mississippi, the daughter of a truck worker and a school teacher. The quiet guy who was her father when she was 8 years old, she was stopped with a quiet voice and calloused hands. She would always remember the terror and high sighs, both hands on the steering wheel. The tremor in his voice as he responded, "Yes, sir," despite not having done anything is amiss. 11 minutes passed during that pause. However, its echo remained in her bones. Later, that experience would mold a legal intellect capable of frightening defense lawyers and daring enough to move entire precincts for violating civil rights. Celia was the youngest at age 35. Deputy Chief Prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Her area of expertise looking into improper arrests, unlawful use of force, and systemic trends of profiling based on race. She had imprisoned sheriffs. She had uncovered orchestrated police cover-ups. She had revised guidelines regarding the use of force procedures that 6 states now required. Nevertheless, the irony wasn't lost on her when, in one of her own investigations, she was found shackled on a pavement like a suspect. She had just concluded a 2-month investigation in Georgia while remaining anonymous and examining surveillance and sealed affidavits, film pertaining to a small-town police force that has a disreputable complaint history. It was intended to be regular, silent, and effective. That afternoon's travel back wasn't a part of Anne's task. She was in her own car, casually clothed, and had her hair tied up for a personal errand. Back, a woman driving home with a file folder in her car without an ID badge, or an escort a podcast humming softly on the stereo in the passenger seat. The community of with 9,000 residents, Mizeville was hardly seen on the map, although it had a standing with FBI investigators. Over the previous 6 years, dozens of complaints had been made. Claims of unlawful stops, threats, and searches that disproportionately targeted people of color. The internal reports had been read by Celia. She didn't anticipate becoming one. The policemen who apprehended her, Officer Mike Bates and Sergeant Paul Harlan, weren't chosen at random. They were well-known names. She had previously read them in case files. Both had been referenced in several complaints that were inexplicably dismissed. No video, no investigation, no repercussions. For weeks, Celia had been attempting to make such connections. Due to a series of unfortunate events and improper profiling, she was now looking directly into their eyes. There was no call-in or legal justification for the halt itself. Not a single registration has expired. Internal investigators made reference to it as a stopper, a made-up excuse for stopping someone. Frequently employed tow search without a warrant. FOR weapons, money, or drugs. Harlan went up to the car with he has his hand on his baton already. Bates scanned the interior while flanking the passenger side. Even though it was daylight, they were using a torch. Celia was wise enough not to grab anything. She partially lowered the window and maintained both hands on the steering wheel. She has utilized this in circumstances similar to this one. Excellent video in hearings at the federal level. She was aware of every protocol, yet she didn't follow it. Shielded her. They inquired as to why she was anxious. Calmly she said, "I'm not." They wanted to know where she was going, back to D.C. She responded, "They insisted that she go outside." For what reason? She inquired, and the yelling started. That was when Bates yelled at her, saying she wasn't complying. The footage from the body cam, which would eventually be examined by media outlets, attorneys and campaigners alike, encapsulated her tone: cool, collected, almost too cool. Their calmness simply made them more aggressive. They were infuriated by Celia's refusal to play the part they had anticipated, and in a matter Harlan broke the glass in a matter of seconds. That violent, piercing, reverberating crack through the neighborhood would turn into the sound that characterized the public's awakening. What nobody Celia was unaware at the moment that a bystander had gone live. Streaming the whole thing from the other side of the street. Reggie, a local barber, has been occupying his store. He was sipping his coffee when he witnessed the events. He captioned it saying, This is crazy. The uncut, unprocessed footage would go viral. The lady hasn't done anything, not because Celia Monroe was a federal prosecutor, but because she could have been anyone. It went viral in a matter of hours. A professional, a teacher, a mother, and a sister are traveling home. That waste truth that struck a chord. The public's reaction reached a critical mass after her name was made public. However, Celia remained silent and unfrightened at the scene before anyone recognized her. Heron rolled his eyes, but she remained silent, refused to answer any more questions, and requested her lawyer. They thought she was lying and chuckled, unaware that her credentials were kept on a government server connected to. They were unaware that as soon as they input her license plate into the DOJ's internal databases system, a warning sign had been raised at the internal security desk of the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. Celia's name was linked to a DOJ asset passing through a recognized risk location while under ongoing investigation. A senior operations officer was alerted, silent, encrypted, and instantaneous. Manager. And the system recorded GPS data. In a matter of minutes, Mizeville, Alabama. Type of incident: unknown, level 3 response protocol, send staff. When the agents showed up, they weren't merely reacting to a disturbance. They were there to apprehend a federal officer, look into possible DOJ procedural violations, and control a situation that had already started to go out of control in the public eye. But even they were surprised by what they discovered when they arrived. Instead of finding turmoil, they discovered Celia standing composedly between two police officers who hadn't yet released her handcuffs, staring at the horizon as if she knew what would happen. When the Suburban drew up next to the scene, Bates and Harlan both backed off a half step. Their bluster fading, they could still see the government markings and the vehicle's matte black surface, as well as the three simple federal agents are outfitted with clipboards and earpieces as they go out. One of them, with a quick glimpse at Celia, Special Agent Carla Jameson, knew right away. At the DOJ workshop on federal oversight, they had trained together. There was no need to meet each other. Just Jameson nodded silently as he passed the officers and inquired coolly, "Is there ISU with this prisoner?" "Who the hell are you?" sneered Harlan. Jameson refused to answer, instead presenting him with a formal letter written by the deputy Director of Civil Rights. Harlan's voice broke at the oversight, authorizing jurisdictional action and prompt review. Since being handcuffed, Celia had remained silent, but she didn't have to because the system she helped create was already going to defend her. But this was about exposure, not revenge, because although it was the first time, this was not the first time someone has been stopped in Mazeville in this manner. With just a license plate scan, the target may have triggered government response. Today, with body cam footage that had been ignored, citizen video, and internal DOJ tracking all coming together in real time, was set to blow up on a national scale for years. When she was released from handcuffs, Celia's shirt blouse was ripped at the sleeve and her wrists were already wounded, but her serene, face inscrutable, stayed calm. Harlan didn't apologize, but Bates muttered one. His jaw was fixed, his gaze flitting between the agents and the group of people gathered on the sidewalk across from them. They realized the tale had outgrown them, but Celia remained silent. Not to the local news van that had arrived, she climbed into the rear of the Suburban, cut off from the cameras, not the agents, the door gently, allowing the quiet to create its own noise. The events of the next 72 hours with Alabama was rocked, and the incident had a nationwide impact. The DOJ confirmed in a formal statement that a senior was wrongfully detained. Illegal arrest. Civil rights organizations immediately mobilized. And a federal official, top trending topics were racial profiling, police misbehavior, body cam reviews, and civil rights investigations. Keywords on social media and during news cycles. But behind the media, Celia was already working, so she wasn't only looking for accountability. Desired trends. Her team started retrieving old complaints from the DOJ's headquarters. From Mazeville, unresolved cases, complaints closed for lack of proof, and settlements sealed. They were reopened one by one, with requests for footage, subpoenas for records. And days later, a new image surfaced. Dozens of regular stops on brown and black drivers without a valid reason basis, falsified event reports, and a concerning pattern. Absent or inexplicably tainted body cam footage on important dates. She received a personal call from the Attorney General, who instructed her to do what she needed to do to carry. She did so without using dramatics or news conferences. Gestures, but with records, testimony, and information. The type of job that doesn't garner media attention until when something breaks. She asked to be in charge of the entire Mazeville police force. Not just a DOJ's most potent civil review, but a pattern or practice judicial process. To identify widespread wrongdoing in law enforcement. It was only given to the worst offenders. Was uncommon, and with severe federal monitors were stationed at Mazeville Police Department for 2 weeks. Each arrest, each report, each stop, each log, and each review. Officers were assigned to administrative leave. While some quietly quit while others hired lawyers, Harlan and federal charges were being brought against the Bates, but Celia was largely out off you. She refused to participate in interviews and avoid becoming a political prop. Because the story wasn't about what this experience showed her, was that the system, when held answerable to its own creators, may yet reflect on itself and make necessary corrections. That silent observation of a machine could serve as a form of public accountability, instead of yelling "crumble" under the weight of its own apathy. But in the background, the case assumes Celia's group found additional evidence of a deeper intricacy. Internal documents from Maysville's chief of police have been training officers to conduct proactive enforcement for 3 years. Tactics on high-risk groups. Although the wording was ambiguous, the inference was obvious. Departmental culture has been indoctrinated to target people based on their race. Rotten apples. The orchard was damaged. Celia wanted more than simply she advocated for accountability, changes, and the retention of body cams, procedures, impartial civilian review panels, and bias education supported by psychological data rather than performance. More significantly, she suggested direct DOJ mentoring for a proactive model, one where underfunded departments with high prejudice ratings, the Attorney General approved, saying that prevention was more important than punishment. Other cities started asking for advice when Congress took notice. All of a sudden, this was about metamorphosis, not only Maysville. The narrative remained popular, trending, and everywhere, but underlying the sensational stories and popular hashtags, the task of rebuilding had started, and Celia went back to the quieter area 2 weeks later in court, not as a witness or even as a victim, but Ash herself, the prosecutor who didn't recoil, and the woman who brought shame to the justice officer who reminded America that power is not determined by volume but rather by vision. It had been decades since Maysville had received this kind of attention. Its police force functioned in the background, unnoticed, unopposed, and shielded from outsiders by the small-town calm. But suddenly, camera satellite trucks are parked next to the neighborhood diner, while protesters stood shoulder to shoulder along the courthouse steps, with reporters brandishing placards that said, "Equal protection is not optional and justice is watching." It was a lady who had refused to be broken, not a politician or media figure, who was at the center of the maelstrom. Celia Monroe wasn't just back in town. Even after her window had been on the verge of entering the hearing that may end the department that had confined her, profiled her, and undervalued her. The atmosphere in the courtroom was lively, and all of the seats were occupied. DOJ state officials sat with lawyers and civil rights watchdogs, and Policy, the presiding federal judge, a well-known figure in the case, was at the front, and analysts were watching intently from the gallery of standing up to wrongdoing by law enforcement. Brought the chamber into order. Within the first hour, Celia's team unveiled recently obtained body cam footage, which was the first explosive moment, footage that was inexplicably missing from the system. The date indicated that it was recorded. On the same day, as 3 hours before to Celia's halt, Sergeant Harlan was captured on camera. "Let's play the game," joking with another police. Another out-of-towner in a Benz. The tone is clear, the laughter was informal, and racial profiling was discovered. Tape. In the icy routine of misbehavior rather than in the heat of the moment when a departmental internal whistleblower testified, it was the second flashpoint, the sole Latina officer on the force. Donna Morales stated in her testimony that for more than Ash had submitted 2 complaints after seeing managers tell rookies to target cars that don't appear to be local. Complaints, which had both disappeared without a trace. She did not falter in her voice, and she concluded her testimony by, "If it hadn't happened to her, it would have happened to," she said, glancing directly at the cops present, someone without a voice, and nobody would have taken them seriously. Celia's final words caused the third surge. Wasn't a big speech, it wasn't prepared, yet it kept the crowd silent. She explained in detail how, despite understanding the law better than those who enforced it, it seemed like you were being treated like a criminal. She turned to face Harlan and Bates and remarked, "I wasn't scared of your badges. Was terrified of what they stood for when they were used carelessly and as a weapon rather than a shield for justice. Of control." Her remarks were surgical rather than angry, and the restraint struck more forcefully. Then came the fourth moment. Louder than any voice, metadata from the department's computer logbooks was uncovered by DOJ cyber forensic specialists, specifically demonstrating deletion activity on body cam servers, all of which were linked to a single precinct console. The chief of police had immediate supervision over the administrator that terminal registered with. The courtroom held their breath as the judge interrupted the session, making it obvious that obstruction of justice at an institutional level. It was a cover-up, not an error. The fifth instance was unexpectedly Richard Blanchard, a white guy in his 60s and a member of the local town council, stood during cameras captured him when he approached to the federal agent's table during break and murmured something and gave them a USB stick, which turned out to include old emails from the town's officials on it, voicing persistent concerns on the department's actions in emails that were either suppressed or disregarded. Blanchard had fearing reprisals. He hoarded duplicates. His voice broke during an impromptu declaration. The world is now watching, but I should have spoken up sooner. As the hearing, the sixth moment came like a lightning strike as they persisted, and the DOJ formally filed a move to place the courtroom exploded as the entire Mazeville Police Department was placed under federal supervision, effective immediately. One of the rarest legal actions in civil rights history. There were gasps, whispers, and reporters scrambling to relay the news. Enforcement, which is typically saved for large metropolitan agencies, but the message was clear: no community, no matter how tiny, is too small to accountability. Nevertheless, the quietest and simplest moment might have had the most profound impact. A 16-year-old girl with big, anxious eyes approached Celia during a break in the session and said, "My mom, she says you made her believe again," she added in a low voice, "watching everything you do." Celia knelt slightly to tell her justice doesn't start in courtrooms. I said, meeting her gaze, grinning softly and whispering back, "It begins." The girl blinked back tears, and two others did the same until we decided that enough was enough. Women in the gallery who had been using their phones to surreptitiously record the conversation. That evening, video from the hearing, the moments that made it human, not simply the frightening numbers or the proof, were all over the internet. Celia's Morales's bravery. The adolescent females muttered something. It wasn't. People all around the nation recognized themselves in the mirror, which was merely a courtroom scene. The eighth instant come in the measured language of federal power rather than in a flurry of court drama. A letter from Thine, an unprecedented move in a case at the municipal level. The statement was read into the record by the Attorney General himself. Solid, free of political glitz. When the tools of justice turn into the tools of coercion, reform is necessary and not voluntary. That letter was intended for every precinct observing, every badge wearer that was present, not just the cops in the room. The complaint may be destroyed. The camera could be switched off, or the quiet of a tiny community could keep that letter. Transformed a local case into a national precedent, burying the truth. Hours later, the ninth flashpoint occurred. In a confidential deposition published according to a court order, Sergeant Harland was previously identified in a federal review conducted in 2021 for participation in an instance of roadside seizures involving a young black driver. The DOJ had suggested a more thorough investigation after the report revealed insufficient probable cause, but the case was lost. Never inquired further till today. It was discovered that the same driver had filed an unsuccessful civil claim, but after being approached by Celia's team, he testified under oath within days that he was threatened, unlawfully searched, and then called by a person claiming to be a municipal mediator who asked him to make a settlement solely. That testimony stopped the room in its tracks. What had appeared to previously disparate instances now became a damaging pattern. The 10th and last, the courtroom moment, was accurate rather than exciting. Judge Daniels, following threefold, "This department does not merely have a bias problem," he remarked, looking down from the bench after days of evidence. "It possesses a constitutional one." He then signed the document putting the Mazeville Police Department under federal control, receivership. Instead of cheering, the audience simply let out a sigh. For many, this wasn't a party. Rather, it was confirmation of what they had learnt in At Last. Whispers may be set out with support, authority, and repercussions. The actual work, however, started outside the courtroom. Celia wasn't finished. She created a mechanism to track racial disparities in order to ensure that the reforms would not only be cosmetic. Metrics for profiling, accessible, Real-time and public-facing gauge stops digital receipt was included in the proposal, along with a time-stamped log that was forwarded to a summary of the officer's report and the reason for the citizen stop on their phone. Transparency is more than merely oversight, but as a safeguard. The DOJ approved Mizeville as a pilot project. 3 other municipalities asked for it within days. However, not everyone was in favor of the local police union resisted the revisions, arguing that the department was being demonized, that police officers were afraid to carry out their duties. Celia replied, facts, not press releases. Crime statistics revealed that targeted stops were not improving community safety. She asked everyone in the town to talk, and one by one, they explained what it was like to be stopped for no reason other than having tinted windows and appearing suspicious. A soft-spoken elderly woman claimed, "They never saw me as a citizen, just as a warning." Her remarks had a greater impact than any headline. Then an unexpected event occurred. A gang of young, newly recruited Mizeville officers, all under 25, publicly broke ranks. They responded to the DOJ's oversight in an open letter saying, "We enlisted to serve with integrity, not to inherit the wrongdoings of others." That letter went viral. It was taken up by outlets, demonstrating that reform was about creating new departments rather than dismantling existing ones. Civilizations within them. Celia silently observed everything, deciding whether to talk and when to keep quiet. She didn't want attention, but that was her power. The country leaned in when she spoke, and when she was asked why she hadn't, because "I didn't need to prove I was right," she said in response to the media on the day of the event. "I required the system to demonstrate that it could be." Just that phrase was taken and played in every majorant work. "Prove it could be" became a catchphrase for systemic change, justice, with local council members, student organizers, and even some police reform organizations using it as a catchphrase. Celia assessed the use of force and remained focused on correcting the procedure, despite the influx of media reports, implemented quarterly bias, and revised antiquated traffic stop procedures. Reviews for agencies that were being investigated. Every policy she suggested turned into a rippling effect. However, she never claimed credit, since Celia's goal was to ensure that she was remembered, not to be remembered, and while the emphasis eventually shifted, as it often does, others were not forgotten. Mizeville altered, the plan persisted, other towns adopted it, and somewhere a young black woman could drive across the nation without worrying about lights flashing behind her. Perhaps not yet. Perhaps not everywhere, but it was no longer impossible. Because a woman possessed the strength, poise, and determination to remind America that justice doesn't scream. It communicates effectively, coolly, and without regret. Long after the cameras had departed and the trending hashtags had subsided, Celia Monroe was sitting in a quiet office in the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ on the 6th floor. Her name was back on then at the headlines, but the files. However, the repercussions of the Mizeville incident were still being felt. Reviewed by a civilian, 3 new states were forming boards. Her case was being requested for legal ethics courses by law schools. However, what the public and media were unaware that Mizeville had never been her last case. The halt to that freeway, something more deeper and more terrible, had been halted. Policy review wasn't the only reason Celia was in that part of Alabama. She had been constructing an undercover investigation for about 8 months. A private federal inquiry into an illicit asset scheme involving multiple states' internal collaboration, false forfeitures, and seizures among a number of rural police forces, as well as a private towing company. DOJ analysts had identified irregularities, minor agencies reporting car seizures worth hundreds of thousands of dollars without any accompanying fees. Celia discovered a pattern when she looked more closely. Drivers of color, out-of-state license plates, and no legal protection. Mizeville police was also present during the middle of it. It was a coincidence that the traffic stop became viral. She had gone dark while traveling in a private lease car that was unmarked in order to evade notice. She didn't anticipate get a profile created, not on that particular day. However, following the incident's public explosion, she came to another realization. Her cover had been damaged by being targeted. but revealed a truth much more than she had imagined. Because following a second review of the body cam footage by federal investigators, they saw something Celia hadn't frame by frame as soon as Sergeant Harlan didn't simply pull her out. Instead, he reached through the broken window. Additionally, he grabbed the folder from her passenger seat, sealed material from her ongoing DOJ case in a folder that was no longer there. Everything changed after that realization. It was no longer limited to police misbehavior. It was obstruction and tampering with federal evidence. Furthermore, if it was deliberate, it indicated that she had either been tipped or recognized by someone within Mayville Police Department. Away. This time, Celia did not return to Mayville via the courts. She left throughout the information. She went through DOJ with each badge number with her federal squad, records of security. They discovered it 2 weeks later. An investigation on Celia's name in a restricted DOJ employee database from 2 days. Before to her arbitrary stop, an IP address within the Mayville Municipal Building. That IP address was linked to A. Curtis Yarrow's deputy chief's desktop. It made sense now. She didn't stop arbitrary. It had been planned. In addition to her skin tone, she had been profiled by place. Someone in that division had discovered her true identity and attempted to seize whatever it was she was carrying. The public was enraged by the viral footage. It had unintentional odysseus, a targeted federal obstruction attempt in its early phases. Celia, however, remained calm. She intensified her efforts. Silently, the initial asset seizure case was reopened by her. This time, connecting it to the towing company's financial records contractor. It was unsettling what she discovered. Bank transfers to a shell in the Dozens Corporation with a Florida registration, all connected to Deputy Chief Yarrow's family. Most of the seized vehicles were sold at private auctions using false identities. Official budgets never received the funds, and many of the drivers did not receive a court hearing at all. Not only was the unfairness systemic, but it was successful, and they now had a paper trail, a name, and a reason. However, Celia had no intention of imposing a press conference. She desired a clever surgical takedown. She collaborated with federal prosecutors, planned a concurrent, multi-agency raid with the U.S. after filing a sealed indictment. Marshals, 3 months after the initial halt. On a calm Thursday morning, 7 individuals were taken into custody in 3 counties. They included Yarrow, 2 ex-officers, a city clerk, and the towing company's proprietor. The accusations include wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to transgress civil rights under false pretenses. The public didn't anticipate it. The majority believed that the court triumph had brought the Mayville saga to a close. But Celia had been crafting an alternative conclusion, one where those who benefited from injustice themselves were escorted out in handcuffs. However, the most poetic moment occurred when Celia unexpectedly returned to the courthouse at Mayville. Not to talk, not to testify, but to observe. She watched the swearing-in of the new interim chief of police from the rear row of the gallery, a former DOJ employee and a black lady officer of training. It didn't explode in the room. It let out a low, respectful exhale. Before the ceremony was over, Celia sneaked out. There, she completed her work, but as she emerged into the sunlight, "Miss Monroe, do you have any comment for the people who still say nothing?" The eager reporter asked as she hurried up. Changed. Celia stopped, gazed directly into the camera, and stated calmly and definitively, "Change doesn't begin when you cry out the truth. It begins when those who attempted to silence it have nowhere else to go," she said. Celia didn't turn around as it reverberated through the camera lens and directly into the headlines. She entered a silent government automobile, shut the door, and drove out of Mayville. Not quite out off retreat, but because the task there was finished. However, even while the arrests were being handled and the news reports yet, her work's true. Influence had just started to spread. In Washington, behind the scenes, Celia's turn had set off a series of events. The Mayville success operation, the covert raid, and the viral exposure led to the DOJ reconsider its strategy for combating corruption in rural law enforcement. Celia suggested a brand new project named a experimental project called Civil. Integrity Watch installed secret investigators with regional organizations that have been suspected of violating civil rights. In contrast to routine audits, these agents would as clerks, training coordinators, or simply as quiet observers, collecting information, spotting trends, and increasing wrongdoing covertly and deliberately. The suggestion was audacious and dangerous, but her credibility was undeniable now. Now, the same lady who had broken the window was redesigning how the future abuse would be stopped by the federal authorities. Avoid it rather than respond to it, the program received approval. By the end of the year, 6 agents had already been deployed. However, even audacious transformation is not immune to criticism. In a matter of weeks, political analysts started to weigh in. While some hailed her as a reforming hero, others accused her of belonging to the federal overreach apparatus. Personal assaults elicited no response from Celia as usual. She concentrated based on facts. She penned a well-crafted opinion piece for the Washington Post that read, "Its hold not accept government insignia, national indignation, and live-streamed violence in order to treat an American citizen with decency during a traffic stop. Integrity makes one powerful, not a badge." And that statement turned into a CATCHRASE. In nationwide protest placards. Integrity Creates Power was painted on canvases, scrolled over murals, and senators during committee hearings on law enforcement reform, as well as in classrooms. However, it wasn't merely a quotation. It was the way she did things. However, just as effective as the federal rage had been, Celia was aware that the courtroom was not the place for lasting justice. It has to be incorporated into training, policy as culture. She had one last request when she got back to DOJ headquarters: to create a publicly interactive map that displays the towns and counties that were currently under the federal government's Civil Rights Federal Review, which had finished reforms and which had pending civil rights litigation. For the first time, anyone in the nation may search for their town and see whether justice was being served or avoided. Despite its unassuming unveiling, the dashboard sent shockwaves. Local divisions that were now visible after skating past anonymously. Transparency wasn't just a theory. No longer. It was irrefutable, searchable, and geographical. The press referred to it as Sulisto her. Digital reckoning was just another method of preventing the window from breaking. The letter then arrived. It arrived without a return address in a plain white envelope. Within was a handwritten message that said, "I was present. I observed. Andy assumed you were simply another target, but you weren't. I did nothing. You were the one who made all the difference. I apologize." No signature or name, but taped Mazeval police patch was attached to the back of the letter. It was worn, ragged, and willingly given up, not out of sentimentality. Celia held it in her hand for a considerable amount of time that evening. But without clarity, as that tiny symbol, silently given up, was more stronger than any judicial decision or trending headline. It was the silent admission OFA system that is breaking within rather than externally. When the year came to an end, Celia rejected offers of promotions. She had no desire to represent change. She aspired to design it. She started educating the upcoming generation of civil rights lawyers how to read and write, in addition to how to construct a case between the lines of missing film, anxiety, and quiet. She informed them of the truth. If you don't know how a system defends itself, you can't defeat it. People continued to discuss that footage, in which she sat peacefully without screaming or retaliating. It rained glass. It was the moment the system broke for some. Others saw it as the time when a new one was created. However, Celia saw it as the start of a protracted battle for equity. She would fight a war with accuracy rather than rage. Truthful, but sound. And always from behind, not behind a podium, the law's wheel.